Hi everybody, this is a video to describe the process of drafting effective thesis statements with specific attention to argumentative thesis statements. So I'm going to go through and talk about some different strategies and approaches for writing thesis statements and things to be keeping in mind as you're doing so. First and foremost, you need to be thinking about your purpose for writing. The goal of your thesis is to convey that purpose to your audience members. The first thing your thesis statement should do is direct your readers to your purpose for writing. It should describe in very clear terms what that purpose is. The next thing it should do is show them what you're ultimately going to do or try to do in your paper or project. So this is often described as a map. It doesn't need to be necessarily a list of things that you're going to do, but you should describe what this paper is going to try to achieve. Lastly, it should also suggest the exigence, the significance, and the why or the so what. Why does this topic matter? Why is your thesis important? Think of this like the context, the motivation for writing. So 3 things: your purpose for writing, why you specifically are arguing what you're arguing, showing them what you're going to do in your paper, and then suggesting the why and the so what. Why do this? Why does it matter? Your thesis needs to be logical and reasonable. It's often tempting to make big overarching claims with our thesis statements, huge moral arguments, or things that might not be realistic to consider. Instead, write your thesis statement in a way that follows logic, that is supported, and that can be achieved reasonably. Here's some examples to help you understand what I mean. A reasonable thesis might look like this. All government-owned buildings and public spaces should be required by law to provide reasonable accommodations for parents and children, including diaper changing stations and dedicated nursing stations. Sweet. So I've given you a specific group of spaces and some very clear, reasonable expectations for what I'd like them to do in response to a problem. An unreasonable example might be all restaurants that do not have changing tables should be immediately closed by the government. That's a pretty unreasonable claim or stance to take. First of all restaurants everywhere in the entire country? That's a huge number. Also, how are we going to go about finding out if they have changing stations or not? How are we going to enforce this rule? And also, the government is responsible for this now? What government? The federal government? State government? Local government? Who am I talking about? This is a huge overarching claim that I'm making, a giant argument that isn't based in fact, doesn't have a lot of clear, reasonable ways to achieve it. I'm also setting my expectations extremely high. See the difference between the reasonable, adequate things that I think could be achieved and all restaurants should be closed. Super unreasonable. Those are extreme examples, but keep in mind the differences between the two. Now, that being said, the thesis statement should be controversial. So it shouldn't be something that anyone reading your paper is automatically going to agree with. Otherwise, what's the point of writing your paper? Here's an example to keep in mind. A controversial opinion might be something like this. Encouraging and supporting women as they nurse their babies is a national health concern that requires government intervention. That's a pretty big claim. I'm taking a leap and saying that not only is nursing good, if women aren't nursing their babies, it's a national health concern. It's something that government agencies concerned with medicine and public health need to be taking action on right now. That's a pretty big claim. It's controversial, but it seems pretty reasonable. A non-controversial thesis statement along the same lines might be something like, women who nurse are providing nutritious food for their babies. Not a lot of arguments are going to be made against that statement. Maybe on the depths of Twitter somewhere, but probably not in a reasonably knowledgeable or educated audience that's going to be reading your paper. That's not a super controversial opinion. See the difference? In one, I'm making a claim that people might argue against. In another, I'm making a claim that's basically a fact. Keeping that in mind, your thesis statement should be provable. And this isn't to say that it needs to be a fact. Instead, provable means that you can support it with evidence. Think of it like an argument in a courtroom. We might have a defendant that we don't know for sure if they're guilty or not. And we might never know 100% because we don't have indisputable facts. However, a lawyer could make an argument that is provable through evidence. This is why there is a burden of proof. So think of your thesis like burden of proof. You have to have some kind of evidence to back up your claim. Here's an example. Something that is provable could be, despite laws that protect parents who choose to nurse in public, not enough is being done to educate parents, law enforcement, and members of the public about those protections, which means too many parents are removed from public spaces or shamed for nursing. This isn't an indisputable fact. However, I could prove this thesis statement through examples, different anecdotes of parents who have been removed from public spaces, the lack of education for parents, law enforcement, and public people. I could use a lot of evidence that I've researched and found to demonstrate why the thesis statement I'm making is true. Something that's not supportable is formula feeding is wrong. First of all, that's a moral argument, and it's also not provable. How can I demonstrate that formula feeding is wrong? Wrong for who? Wrong in what circumstances? It's not a very reasonable thesis to be making in the first place, but it also can't be proved. So think about provable as not indisputable, but it's something that can be demonstrated with evidence. Another way to think about that is that your thesis statement is still an opinion. It's still something that's based on what you have found, on your knowledge and your perspective. A fact-based thesis is something that isn't an opinion and doesn't really make sense to be using in this circumstance. So for example, a fact-based thesis might be something like, although 80% of babies begin breastfeeding, less than 1/3 are breastfed at 12 months. It's not something that can be argued, either for or against, because it just is a fact. It's based on data. So that's not the kind of thesis we want to be thinking about for our argument papers. Instead, we want something that is an opinion. It might be something that's provable. It's something that can be argued and demonstrated through evidence, but it ultimately still is controversial, something that's up for debate. A fact-based thesis isn't really worth arguing. That would be an informative paper, which is not what we want to do here. Next, I want to describe some strategies for approaching your thesis statement. Answer your research question. So your thesis shouldn't be a question, but you can and should be responding to a question. So keep in mind that you shouldn't end your introduction or that first paragraph with a question. You should be responding to that research question in some kind of way. That's really what your thesis is all about, responding and answering the question that you've posed. You should be specific. So address the who, what, where, when, why, and how questions that might arise from a vague thesis statement. Be specific about your audience, who it is you want to take action, what that action is, where you're talking about this action taking place, and so forth. Be specific about those things so there's no room for confusion or debate amongst your audience members about what it is you ultimately mean. Being concise, clear, and specific is really important when you're writing academic, argumentative papers. Don't be afraid to take a stance. Avoid straddling the lines of an argument or being vague about what you mean. Approach your argument with confidence because you've done the research. You've gone out and made an informed argument based on things that you have found through that research, whether it be secondary or primary research. Even if you think some readers are going to disagree with you, still be firm in your stance. Keep in mind that that's the ultimate reason for your writing. You want to convince your readers of your perspective and the stance that you're taking, and there might be some pushback for that. That's okay. That's the point of writing an argument paper in the first place. So don't hem and haw or say, some people might think this, some other people might think this. Take a stance. Be confident in the research you've done and the knowledge that you've gained from that research. Support that stance with evidence, though. So don't just present an opinion or a point of view without any support or fact. Yes, your thesis needs to be an opinion. It should be provable, though. You need to demonstrate that it can be proved with that evidence you found. Provide data and support throughout your project that supports your position, that you can expand on. So don't just say, this is the way it is. Demonstrate why you think that is the way it is. Keep in mind that your thesis is all about the topic and the main point or purpose or argument. So it's all of these components blended together. It is your purpose for writing, it is the context of the problem, as well as the reason why it's important. Your thesis should contain all of these elements and clearly articulate your argument for your reader. Here are some things to be doing while you're considering your thesis statement. Revise your tentative thesis statement with these criteria in mind. So be thinking about whether or not your thesis is provable, is controversial, is an opinion. Are you taking a clear stance, or are you hemming and hawing? Determine your topic, your argument, and the how or why that you're addressing. Outline a possible organizational structure for your project that could argue that thesis. So what is some information that you need to be providing early on? And where can you get into the more narrow, the deeper sections of your argument? Begin gathering your source material. What quotations, what paraphrases, what data are you going to use to support that thesis? Having a document or a list of different quotations and sections of your source material that you want to use can be really helpful. You might even include references to those specific sources in your outline. Using all of these tasks as a way to start planning out your research project is a great way to get started on the writing process. Let me know if you have any questions or ways that I can help you develop a clear, concise, and effective thesis for your research.